Chapter 741, Embrace the Fear in Your Heart. You seem to have overestimated yourselves. As a saint-level master, Sal wouldn't be easily defeated even though it had to fight two opponents at the same time. Demon Spirit Sal glanced around and saw that the elves, dwarves, and humans indeed outnumbered them, but the difference in numbers wasn't too big. It's been a long time since our last battle, so perhaps you've forgotten the combat force of the Shadow Legion, Sal said with a snicker. You dare to fight us with this messy and mismatched army? What do you think you can do to me? The soldiers of the Shadow Legion were all veteran fighters who could each fight 10 enemies at the same time. In the busiest times, the soldiers of the Shadow Legion fought several wars in 1 year and had toughened themselves in countless battles of blood and fire. The old Orc King, who didn't know much, turned grim, but the first elder of the elf clan smiled as he said, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. At this moment, Mr. Dirk and the others thought, we go on the battlegrounds each day. We began fighting in small-scaled battlegrounds such as Warsong Gulch ever since we were at level 10 and have since then battled in all kinds of large battlegrounds at maximum level. We fought in dozens of battlegrounds each day when we tried to level up prestige ranks. We've trained like this for more than 1 year now. Do you think you're better than us? On the battleground, the bunch of commanders in the game when players fought on battlegrounds in World of Warcraft began to issue orders and shouted wildly, warriors, shield wall, push up, keep some protection, paladins here to protect the nannies, mages, throw blizzards at the crowds of enemies. Magic spells, storms, blood, and thunder swept across the battlefield. Sal found that instead of subduing the messy and mismatched army, its soldiers were shrinking in formations under pressure until they were forced to gather together in the center of the valley. How can it be? Sal roared, and it was answered by a huge fireball which crashed down at him like a meteorite. Boom! Boulders fell from the mountains, and fire blazed like the burning sun. Before the dust settled, a forceful gust shot toward Demon Spirit Sal's face as a huge sword crashed toward him. The powerful wind that the sword strike created pressed down the ground by several meters. Boom! The sky and the ground shook violently. Dodging and escaping almost instantly, a black figure shot up into the sky at a speed so fast that it was impossible to follow its movements with naked eyes. In pursuit, two figures flew across the battleground like two lightning flashes. Then, mountains collapsed as boulders fell, and the ground cracked. Demon Spirit Sal saw an opportunity to fight back. Black clouds gathered in the sky while countless lightning bolts poured down like a waterfall. Under the thunderclouds, that figure looked like a demonic god. I'll show you what war magic looks like. Counterspell. The white-bearded and white-haired old elf chanted lightly and waved his magic staff. A magic light flashed, and the black clouds in the sky scattered as the thunder instantly turned mute. If I can't interrupt that, then all my efforts in the raids this year are wasted. The old elf said majestically. Puchy. While spewing a mouthful of black blood, Sal felt a strange magic energy forcefully interrupting his spell. Its face twisted in fury. What the heck was that? Before it could think, the huge sword swept across its waist, even cutting the ocean like black clouds behind him that weren't fully scattered into two halves. If Demon Spirit Sal hadn't ducked in time, the sword would have cut it into two halves as well. Fighting two peak saint-level masters at the same time, Demon Spirit Sal was at a complete disadvantage. How can it be? These people's combat strength went beyond its expectation. After all, it had consumed lots of energy and effort to kill the old Orc King. Now that the Orc King was resurrected, Demon Spirit Sal's remaining energy was obviously not enough to deal with the old Orc. Besides, it was shocked by its opponent's strange spells, which were simple but very effective. Retreat. In this instant, all it could think of was this word. As an ultimate master, Demon Spirit Sal carried out its thought in one breath. Hovering in the sky, it inhaled deeply, and the big cloak that covered its body bulged into a huge black ball. Even from the distance, people could feel the destructive energy that it contained. No. The first elder of the elf clan immediately waved his staff, and a tremendous force shot out from his staff and transformed into a huge water barrier, engulfing everyone in the area. In the next moment, the destructive energy erupted like a volcano and swept across the sky and the land, turning everything that it touched, including the trees, soil, and the soldiers of the Shadow Legion, into dust. Even the pale blue water barrier shook under its force and eventually collapsed. A black shadow instantly fled to the distance at a speed undetectable by the naked eyes. After clearing the remaining forces of the Shadow Legion, the orcs, dwarves, and elves looked a bit disappointed. It got away. It can't get away. Looking at the direction that demon spirit Sal fled, Mr. Fang said casually, "Huh, sir, you got an idea?" Some elves walked up to him and stared at him as if he was Daruman. Meanwhile, on the other battleground, the figure riding on the shadow demon dragon still hovered high in the sky. It looked as if it was a demonic god dominating over the whole battleground. Nations Summit was a grand palace. The ultimate masters projected their images in the elegant rooms on the top level of the palace, and in the center of the hall was the spiritual spell visual projection showing the whole battleground. A group of people were watching it avidly. The battle was entering a fierce stage, and the humans had obviously obtained the upper hand. Elf Queen, Your Majesty. Dressed in a spotless white sorcerer's robe, Street Dylan said with a smile. If your elves don't come now, this war will soon come to an end under the leadership of our Judgment Godly Palace. After that, history will always remember our great achievement. St. Dylan laughed. Huh? From the lofty throne, a pair of beautiful eyes looked down. She thought, I sent a large group of elves to help them. How come I don't see any of them? The Dwarf King also felt puzzled, thinking, I sent a large group of dwarves to the war as well. Meanwhile, in the Magic Forum Eye of Mystical Realms, according to the latest news, many masters have gathered at the border of Lianshan Principality and formed an iron defense line. The Shadow Legion can't break it. We're winning. This news was posted by Master Orf. Cheers erupted in the forum, and the commenters almost knelt and called him Daddy. Meanwhile, they didn't forget to trash the silent Blizzard Braggers and Origins fighters. Too bad, the Blizzard Braggers lost their chance. I guess they are being delayed by the many corpses on their way. After all, they must show off their resurrection spells. Blizzard Braggers are still on their way. Ha 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 ha. Sword Saint Claus would say, you're not needed here, go and do some logistic work. Ha ha ha. Blizzard Braggers can only do logistic work. Don't take it seriously. Anyway, the resurrection spells are not real, and what can they help with in terms of logistics? At this moment, the Death Lord who hadn't moved a muscle cracked a cold smile under his helmet. How are the seeds of nightmare? Beside it, the slim and thin figure slightly nodded. It looked at the fierce battle on the battleground like a god who could dictate everyone's life and death. Embrace the fear in your heart. Chapter 742, A Sudden Change for the Worse. Ever since she began playing World of Warcraft, Helen had felt a nightmarish power growing inside of her. She was troubled by nightmares every night, and those weird and creepy scenes in her dreams woke her up, making her too afraid to sleep. However, after Salah recommended Outlast to her, Helen began to change. Previously, it had been hard to sleep, and now she just didn't dare to close her eyes. Whenever she remembered that the fat demon-like man who chased her around throughout the game was finally turned into meat paste by the supernatural existence that worked above the laws of nature, she would shiver involuntarily. The scarier thing was that the supernatural existence had crawled into her body. As for the previous nightmares, for some reason, Helen felt that the power which caused nightmares seemed to be stirring in her body again, but she felt like the supernatural existence inside her could instantly slam the creepy things in her nightmares into meat pies, and she thought, are those things really scary? While shaking her head, Helen murmured, forget it, I still feel like Outlast is more frightening. Now, she felt that she could punch any horrifying monster which had scared her senseless before. She was now very tough. I feel like I'm becoming a tomboy. Helen patted her cheeks and followed the others to continue the rescue mission. Although the symbol of life in the game could only be used once, the items recreated by the system were all top quality. Obviously, the items that Mr. Fang gave these players were truly top-level objects. The tremendous life energy contained in these symbols of life could be used more than once. After the paladins and priests resurrected many people, the energy in these items still hadn't run out. The people who could use the symbols of life must have the talent to learn redemption or resurrection, and there weren't many people who could do that. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many people who couldn't be resurrected in the later story of World of Warcraft. The rescue team walked through the desolate ruins and searched for orcs and humans whom they could resurrect. During the process, these people received blessings and gratitude from countless people and witnessed the joy of coming back to life after death. Usually, the corpses of masters were relatively intact while the civilians, farmers, and other ordinary people couldn't be resurrected even with the godly items such as these symbols of life. At such moments, these people would be struck by deep sorrow and could do nothing but give their sincere blessings. May the holy light be with you. Helen prayed for them, wishing more than ever that such catastrophes wouldn't come again. Luckily, this horrifying legion didn't have the time to go to each city and village in the Orc Kingdom, so the rescue team only needed to follow the Shadow Legion's footprints and search city by city. My friends from the Independent Peoples in Guild asked me to find an orc named Nsta. Salah searched around anxiously. Do they know what happened here? Helen asked. No, I haven't had the heart to tell them the truth. Many people have asked me to figure out the situation with these orcs. Commander Elvin said, don't tell them yet. More than anyone else, Elvin knew how it felt to have a good friend die. While they searched around anxiously, he knew how impatient and anxious that the players in the distant East Continent were feeling right now. Wait until we resurrect them all. Today, everyone got so busy that they wished they could split themselves into groups of 10 so that they could do more work. Even Mr. Fang closed his new shop when he came out. Mr. Fang's shop was located in the busy zone of the city, and many people passed it each day. Glass, the Knight Captain and the senior priest of the Kanglan City branch of Judgment Godly Palace suddenly saw a group of people pointing in the direction of Origins Internet Club. What's happening? The Origins Internet Club is closed. Glass casually posted the news on the Magic Forum. Origins Internet Club seems to have shut down. It's closed for the whole day. It's shut down. It's the end of the Blizzard braggers. Ha ha ha. Countless Blizzard haters spread the news and rejoiced the downfall of the shop. In the Radiant Light Godly Nation, Master Lywood, Master Orth, and even people laughed when they saw this news. An achievement. This time, we've obtained a great achievement. People's voice shook in excitement. Go check and see if the news is true. Meanwhile, at the border of Lianshan Principality, the battle between human elites and the soldiers of the Shadow Legion was a conflict of blood and fire. Large groups of soldiers of the Shadow Legion and human soldiers fell, and then more swarmed up. Even the ultimate saint-level masters, the strongest beings on the continent, could find enemies who matched their strength among the enemies. The horrifying energy releasing from the battleground exploded in the sky again and again, even piercing and shattering the thick clouds and leaving shocking marks in the sky. None of these masters noticed, or perhaps didn't have time to notice, that an invisible fear silently spread across the battleground. It seemed that the seeds that were once planted in the depths of people's hearts had rooted and began to sprout. Like a plague, the fear spread in everyone's mind as if an extremely horrifying thing tried to crawl out from the bottom of their hearts. Darkness. These people seemed to see endless darkness in which the countless creepy things that had once appeared in their nightmares now took shape before their eyes. No. While shouts of fear sounded, one of the humans suddenly dropped his weapon and fled. After the first deserter, there were the second and the third. In fact, while some were still hesitating and struggling, they were executed by the enemies. What's happening? Grand Mage Adolf was casting spells when he noticed the weird state of a mage beside him. Then, as if he had turned crazy, this mage shot out a heaven-burning fire cloud. Caught off guard, his comrades were caught in the fire and fell from the sky while screaming, "How can it be?" In the nation's summit, the projected images all stood up and watched the scene incredulously. The invisible fear was still spreading. The situation made a sudden change for the worse. Gradually, the sky above the city was engulfed by this horrifying fear which spread among the crowds in silence, turning fighters to crazy people one after another. The city that was full of lively people was instantly turned into a ghost realm. Chapter 743, The Darkest Moment. Godly spells. Use godly spells. Sword St. Claus sent by the radiant light. Godly nation finally noticed the weird situation and roared. But when he looked at the godly spell mage group of the Judgment Godly Palace, he saw a horrifying scene. All the godly spell mages looked dazed with contracted pupils as if they had been plunged into an ocean of fear and were experiencing some extremely scary stuff. Some of them attacked their comrades like crazy people and didn't stop even though the latter had turned into corpses. Do you really think that this poorly mixed army can hold us off? At this moment, the tall and thin figure standing beside the shadow demon dragon finally said, "A bunch of morons. We let you think that you were in a stalemate with us to lower your guard. We only did that to take down your godly spell mages." Like an invisible nuclear bomb, it swept across the whole battleground. The shadows in the sky spread across the sky above the city, plunging the clear sky into chilliness and darkness. In the nation's summit, Street Dylan's face turned livid at this scene. Meanwhile, all the Saint-level masters sensed that their enemies turn fiercer at an instant. Although the Saint-level masters were not influenced by the sense of fear as the average warriors and mages were, the situation on the battleground had instantly turned worse. The soldiers of the Shadow Legion killed their way into their enemies, encountering almost no resistance, except a few who were still struggling. The 100,000 elite warriors would probably all die on this horrifying battleground if no one could change this situation. A streak of black light suddenly shot across the sky. Warm blood gushed out and dyed the sky red instantly. The Saint-level warrior dressed in golden armor was the ultimate master and the king of Lianshan Principality. He had an ugly and shocking wound in his waist. TL note: although principalities are only ruled by princes and don't have kings, we decided to stick to the author's original words for better context. Where are you looking at? Before him was a humanoid monster with a horrifying look. Blood was dripping down from the blade of the huge sickle in his hand. The monster lifted the sickle and lightly licked the blood on the blade, as if it was savoring rich wine. In the sky, a tremendous and terrifying energy gathered on the horizon and then transformed into a human figure. It was Street Dylan. It was the solid figure image through spiritual spell visual projection, and this figure contained at least 30% of his power. With a wave of his hand, a layer of mystical light spread out. Under the illumination of the light, the dense terrifying atmosphere finally dissipated a little. However, when the lights dimmed, the atmosphere of fear began to gather again. Anyway, their warriors who had gone crazy due to fear finally regained some senses. Pursued by the Shadow Legion, countless soldiers fled at all costs, and only less than half were left. The previously arrogant human elites scrambled to run as if they were scared witless. Then, the Saint-leveled masters began to retreat while fighting. Under the wild counter-attack of the Shadow Legion, some of them were wounded. Retreat. Street Dylan's projected figure said in a deep voice. Retreat, retreat now. Sword St. Claus yelled. At this moment, the figure sitting on the Shadow Demon Dragon in the sky finally moved. The huge saber engulfed in blazing flames slashed out and seemed to cut a huge crack in the sky. A few Saint-level masters were the targets. Just as they were about to block it, they were sent flying by a horrifying force. Some saint-level masters with relatively low cultivation strength instantly spewed out blood. Rain began to fall from the sky, which was turning even gloomier. Rain water washed the blood on the ground, forming bright red creeks and running through streets and lanes in the city. They just fell like this. We just lost like this. The previously arrogant faces turned silent and looked lost while they watched this scene. They were the strongest and ultimate masters in the world. They had even thought of battling to the death in glory, but had never imagined that they would fail so miserably. Retreat, retreat, retreat. For them, it seemed like the war ended before it truly began. Retreat. The monster with a human upper body and hooves slowly landed from the sky under the support of horrifying lightning bolts and hurricanes, and it descended before everyone. It said in a deep and weird voice, "We wouldn't have wasted so much time and energy if we didn't want to gather all of you here for destruction. We wouldn't have to waste time and find each one of you one by one." Each word it said seemed to shake the surrounding space, and the vast and uncontrollable energy that it emitted transformed into hurricanes and even tore open the space. With a wave of its hand, a thick lightning arc crashed onto Street Dylan's spiritual spell visual projection, which instantly shattered into debris of energy. In the Conference Hall of Nations Summit, the unshaven evil face of the humanoid creature with hooves filled the spiritual spell visual projection. The dwarves, elves, and ultimate human masters were all watching this scene. It looked up at the high sky, which seemed to have been plunged into horrifying darkness. It seemed like a giant existence had blocked all the sunlight in the sky. Damn it, we can't project figures into this area. What are they doing? No, we can't retreat. At this moment, the middle-aged man dressed in golden armor, who was also the king of Lianshan Principality and the only saint-level master of this middle-sized nation, yelled, "We can't retreat." The south of this city was a plain that one couldn't see the end of with one glance, which meant if this city was lost, the Shadow Legion could swarm into the nation without any resistance. If that happened, the entire Lianshan Principality and its people would be finished. "We can't retreat." This man roared hoarsely, but no one seemed to hear him while they continued to retreat. No. With a desperate hoarse roar, he watched in helplessness as the Shadow Legion shattered the city walls, buildings, and everything else in the city. It mercilessly crushed everything before dashing toward the center of the principality. He seemed to see another human kingdom falling before the Shadow Legion. It was a nation built with numerous generations of effort. "We can't retreat." He grabbed the armor sword Saint Claus, who was sent here by the Radiant Light Godly Nation. Claus shrugged off his hand coldly. "You're crazy, Mr. Lden." The slightly bald middle-aged man looked around with a cold gaze, feeling like his heart was bleeding. When the saint-level masters left one by one, the heroic-looking young man couldn't bear it anymore. This young man's features looked quite like those of the Lord of Lianshan Principality, and his armor was covered in cuts. He raised his blade and charged back into the enemies. With furious roars, his chest was pierced by many spears and blades. Ah! The middle-aged king, who was also the only saint-level master of Lianshan Principality, finally charged back. "I know that a small nation like ours is insignificant. Despite all this, only I can't retreat." Like a maniac, he charged forward and shouted, "This is my land. If I must die, I need to die on this land. I'll show you that even a small nation has its dignity." This man waved his giant sword, and he blocked many spears, swords, and other weapons while warm blood sprayed up into the pitch-black sky. At this moment, Wilson suddenly stopped his steps. "Perhaps you're right." A pitch-black sickle tore open the sky, and the nation-protecting sword saint of the Morning Light Empire suddenly vanished on the spot. When he appeared again, he accurately blocked the deadly sickle. "If everyone sits back and watches like this, I'm afraid that no one will help us when we need help," he shouted. Hearing his words, some of the other saint-level masters hesitated and finally stopped their steps. "A bunch of morons. Several Saint-level masters including Sword Saint Claws left swiftly with their troops. Without the radiant light godly nation, the most powerful ally, this was possibly the darkest moment in these people's lives. Chapter 744. The horn is blowing. There is an ancient relic in the southwest of the city. Alden said, the defensive magic array which is now in repair over there could be of some use. There were many old-fashioned war weapons too. It would be better than our current situation. He added, I've requested reinforcements from my empire. Nation protecting Sword Saint Wilson of the Morning Light Empire said, if we can hold on until the reinforcements arrive, we might still have hope. The remaining humans led the Shadow Legion to the ancient Chinlin Hill relic in the southwest of the city, reorganized, and formed new formations. With fierce tiger and dragon-like roars and shouts on the battleground, the Shadow Legion fought with the human army once more, but the latter could obtain almost no advantage except for the useful terrain and some outdated war weapons. Don't retreat. King Alden lifted his huge sword. His nation wasn't very powerful, but facing the enemies that had forced even the powerful nations to flee, they knew they had no right to retreat. He glanced around the soldiers who looked uncertain, lost, and desperate. He felt those feelings too, but he couldn't show any on his face. Behind us are our families, friends, and our loved ones. Think about what would become of them if we retreat. Your prince, my most excellent son, has just died in battle. Perhaps I'll die in battle today as well, but I'd rather die standing on the city wall at the border of our Lianshan Principality than survive by fleeing in shame. Seeing the hesitation on the faces of the soldiers of the Morning Light Empire, Wilson yelled, if we retreated today, just imagine when they come to the gate of our nation and we must face them alone. Can we still retreat? I can't guarantee that you will live, but I need you right now. Get in formation. The remaining Saint-level masters from the neighboring nation also roared. In the sky, the Sky Knight Legion formed a long array, looking like a huge soaring eagle spreading out its wings. On the ground, their warriors advanced forward while holding shields before them, as the array of the ancient relic in the southwest lit up with pale blue lights. Countless flames and frosts exploded among the enemies. Their warriors stood in one line and formed a great iron wall. Behind their warriors, the mage group slowly flew into the sky. Firestone meteorite, 500 yards ahead. Grand Mage Adolf squinted his turbid eyes as he looked at the sky worriedly. Like a black flood, the Shadow Legion viciously crashed at the iron defense line while the few remaining Saint-level masters fiercely fought the enemies. They were surrounded by large groups of flying knights and monsters. Meanwhile, the Saint-level masters of the Shadow Legion just stood and watched, intending to deplete their opponent's spirit and energy. Darkness in the sky engulfed the whole city and everyone's heart. Like a heavy boulder, it almost suffocated everyone under it. The retreat of the radiant light godly nation meant that the Lianshan Principality was deserted. Now, they could only rely on themselves to protect their land, people, and nation. To live or to die, it would be determined by heaven. At this moment, Mr. Fang led his internet cafe rescue team to the north and finally reached the place where the Shadow Legion made its first attack. They saw the Lion Man leaning on the huge shield that was as tall as one man. Beside him, some orc warriors supported their bodies with huge swords or huge hammers, not willing to retreat one step even in the last moment of their lives. They might be insignificant, but they had formed the first line of defense of the Orc Kingdom. A streak of warm holy light fell from the sky, and the Lion Man was woken up as if he was in a sweet dream. At this moment, except for the elves, dwarves, and humans, there gathered a large number of orcs. The old Orc King lifted his weapon and shouted, "Peers, it's time to fight back. Sir, say something." While they advanced south toward the Shadow Legion by following its track, the knights, elves, and orcs walked with Mr. Fang in the center. Mr. Fang looked embarrassed. This isn't my strong suit. He slightly thought for a moment. The reinforcements from the neighboring empires and kingdoms rushed to the rescue, despite the fresh blood joining the battle. The battleground at the border of the Lianshan Principality consumed the human forces continuously like a huge millstone. Looking at the large flocks of huge black birds circling in the sky and the cold-blooded soldiers of the Shadow Legion who seemed fearless, these people had never felt so desperate before. Like flames, once it was ignited, despair spread out quickly. Street Dylan, a priest reported in a low voice, Sword St. Claus has retreated safely with the godly spellmage group, but some nations didn't retreat. At the nations summit, Street Dylan looked at the spiritual spell visual projection before him calmly and said, "This time, we indeed underestimated them. As everyone can see, I gave them the chance to retreat, but they gave it up. Now, let's talk about how to build a new defense line. I think we must put out 100% of our forces this time to deal with this crisis." The representatives from the Elf clan and the Dwarf clan frowned. The dwarf who was wearing a crown stood up and said, "Forgive me for my bluntness, but I think we must reconsider if we should form an alliance with people who deserted their allies. People with great ambition don't concern themselves with trifling matters." Street Dylan stood up from his seat and said, "On our side, we have Street Hines who can listen to the gods' words, and we also have Isabella Her Highness whose strength has surpassed all the people in the world." Dressed in a pale golden long dress and wearing a silver-colored crown, the woman with eyes that were as bright as stars nodded slightly at his words. One must understand the situation and know when to retreat, otherwise... Street Dylan pointed at the spiritual spell visual projection which showed great casualties of human soldiers and the desperate howling of the remaining ones. Ah! On the battleground, the middle-aged man's golden armor had been dyed red by blood. Beside him were piles of corpses of the soldiers of the Shadow Legion, soldiers and human warriors. His hand that grasped onto the sword shook slightly while the huge wound in his shoulder numbed half of his body. He turned his head and looked at Wilson, who was also covered in blood. "Don't ask me why." Wilson looked reminiscent. "Do you remember the sword saint of the Hymia family?" He closed his eye slightly and said, "She was my wife, she died on the same battlefield." His sword was different from others, slim and exquisite. It seemed to be a decorative sword used by some aristocrat. "I don't want to retreat again," he hooah, unleashing the last bit of energy in his body. He charged at the huge shadow in the sky. Then, blood sprayed into the sky and dyed it red. "You overestimate yourself." The demonic godlike figure staying in the high sky looked indifferent. "Humans are just bugs that tremble and beg for mercy at the feet of gods," the tall and thin figure said. "Do you want to form an alliance with them?" Street Dylan laughed. Chirk. Suddenly, they heard a shrill yell and saw demon Spirit Sal flying over like a ghost. Suddenly, everyone saw a shocking scene. A weird bolt of Saber energy appeared at where Demon Spirit Sal was. After the Saber energy flashed by, the demonic godlike's body slowly split into two halves after a long while. Exclamations erupted at the nation's summit. "What's happening?" Dimension slash. The data strings that were flowing in Fang Chi's eyes gradually dimmed while he withdrew the sword. Then, the people who had been waiting for Mr. Fang to speak finally saw him open his mouth. His gaze seemed to see through time and space and rested on the distant blue planet that he could never return to. May. Fang Chi opened his mouth and said in silence, "When we face despair, may our past youth and passion form your hardest shield. May the holy light be with you." You. With a deep sound of the horn, these people dashed toward the center of the battlefield, howling like a pack of wolves. Chapter 745, Miracle. At that moment, I understood that people call us Supreme Saint-level Masters not because we are powerful. Instead, they look up to us and call us saints because we far surpass people who are weaker than us. When we face existences stronger than us, we would also feel weak, desperate, and lose composure like an average person. The so-called saints are just a joke for ignorant people. because we're still mortals and thus weak people. Despair filled the battleground. Perhaps godly miracles would be sent from the supreme god's peak on the continent and drive out these horrifying monsters, but it had nothing to do with these people now. With shaky arms, Sword Saint Wilson put his weight on the sword and struggled up. This man who had always looked aristocratically elegant was now disheveled with ugly wounds all over his body. But we're the ultimate masters already. This man slashed out the blade and created several radiant blood flowers in the air. The slim sword, which looked like a decoration for aristocrats, could still unleash horrifying power in his hand. The remaining forces and the generals from different nations charged again and again, but were plunged into greater despair each time. However, the despair vanished when the newly arrived demon spirit was cut into two halves. That act seemed to be a declaration of war. Yes, a declaration of war. Wilson couldn't imagine who on this continent dared to declare war by killing a commander of the Shadow Legion. Not only he, but the remaining commanders of the Shadow Legion were stupefied by this scene as well. Everyone in the conference hall of the Nations Summit was also staring at the scene dumbfoundedly. Who the heck did it? Suddenly, they heard booming sounds of hooves striking the ground from the distant. A group of people gradually appeared on the distant horizon. There were orcs with different features, stout dwarves, well-equipped elves, and a group of people wearing robes with pointy hoods, looking like neither mages nor warriors. The most eye-catching one was the young man in the front of the group. Instead of riding on a flying mount, he stood on his sword but moved faster than any flying magic beasts. Those seem to be my elves. In the conference hall, the pair of eyes that were as beautiful as the mirror lake in the Sylvan Moon Forest widened when watching the scene in the spiritual spell visual projection. I seem to see Elder Sork. Sitting in the seat that belonged to the dwarf clan, the stout and imposing dwarf dressed in a coat made of magic beast fur said, "Forgive me for being blunt," Street Dylan said. "If I were you, I would summon them back immediately. If they are trying to attempt a rescue now, they would certainly die." At this moment, the most magnificent figure who had been sitting on the demon shadow dragon and supervising the battle like a demonic god also saw the weird disturbance on the other side of the battleground. But, since the human alliance didn't have the support of the radiant light godly nation and had almost collapsed, the Shadow Legion had enough energy and force to turn around and deal with these overconfident newcomers. What do they want to do? At this moment, the Saint-level masters who had retreated from the battleground were also in the meeting that was discussing the creation of a new defense line. Sword Saint Claus said with a snort, "They didn't come until this moment. Are they here to seek deaths?" Obviously, he was resentful that these people hadn't come earlier. Meanwhile, he thought, do you think your randomly mixed army can achieve the result that so many Saint-level masters couldn't manage? Are you trying to insult me? To be honest, World Mage Hematon said with a smile, I have no intention to belittle these elves and dwarves, but according to the previous situation, I feel like they can't last more than 5 minutes. At this moment, the Dwarf King and the Elf Queen had similar thoughts. What on earth are you doing here? At this moment, the two armies were about to battle. Shield wall. A shout suddenly came from the sky. Right now, Mr. Fang became the commander since he was the only person who could temporarily order the orcs, elves, and dwarves for the time being, different from the light shield that would light up above the players' heads in the original version of the game. The thick essence in their body traveled into the shields in their hands and transformed them into dazzling huge shields that were as hard as a wall and extremely eye-piercing. Then, the audience saw something so unimaginable that they suspected their eyes were playing tricks on them. Boom! Blocked by the thick and huge shields which looked like a huge wall, the Shadow Legion that looked like an unstoppable flood suddenly paused as if they encountered a big dam. Blizzard, blizzard. With the chanting of the mages in the backline, the air began to become dense, and the temperature lowered to 0, swiftly condensing the moisture in the air. The rain clouds in the sky quickly condensed into thick ice pellets which shot down with the acceleration of gravity and crashed onto the crowds of Shadow Legion like meteorites. Then, the orc warriors charged forward like ferocious tigers that were released from cages. They hacked their huge hammers and axes toward their enemies with heaven-splitting fury. How can it be? These people weren't defeated within 5 minutes as expected. Instead, the audience actually saw that this randomly mixed army had obtained the upper hand. And how come there are so many orcs? Wasn't the Orc Kingdom destroyed? Seeing this scene, the Human Alliance army who had been plunged into a death battle seemed to see a glimpse of hope in the darkness of despair. Comrades, pump up your spirit. Sword Saint Wilson shouted, I don't know who's helping us, but it's undoubtedly a strong army. Pick yourselves up and show people our strength. Follow me closely, let's kill our way out. Attack. After the moment of despair, they finally saw hope. With inexplicable excitement, they fought their way out fiercely. However, it was very hard to fight to the other side of the battleground. They might die before they could achieve this feat. Obviously, Mr. Fang noticed the situation on this side. Healers follow up, kill your way over. Like a sharp arrow, this army shot into the enemy's heart. However, when they merged with the remaining Human Alliance army, Street Dylan said with a sneer, is this commander a pig? If they fought with the previous formation, they might have a chance, but now, they had disrupted their own formation. Now, Fang Chi led all the people into the enemies who outnumbered them. He's indeed only a young man. Moron. At this moment, even the figure of the Shadow Legion who was in the high sky revealed a cruel smile. I'll take his head. Ah. Mr. Fang nodded. Suddenly, everyone saw a scene that they could never forget for the rest of their lives. The dark clouds in the sky seemed to be pierced by a strong light. A figure seemed to walk out from the light beam while holy light sprinkled onto the ground, driving out all catastrophes and hardships. It was unbelievable. The figures stood up from the ground one after another as if all their fatigue and pain had evaporated. In this instant, the generals and soldiers of the Human Alliance army had the unconscious urge to kneel and worship. It was a stunning sensation coming from the bottom of their hearts. Seeing this scene that was like a godly miracle, everyone in the nation's summit stood up instantly in astonishment. They had never felt so shocked before. Chapter 746, For the Alliance. What's that? Even the loftiest scent-level masters sitting at the nation's summit couldn't hide the shaking in their voices. It was probably the first time in their lives that they couldn't control their emotions, or in other words, couldn't keep the emotions from showing on their faces. Even the commanders of the Shadow Legion stared at the scene intently. They had never imagined that such a scene would appear on this battleground. What happened? World Mage Hematon looked at Street Dylan in horror and asked, what did they do? He looked as if he didn't believe his eyes. With widened eyes, he looked at the scene in the spiritual spell visual projection again to make sure he had seen it correctly. At this moment, the fallen soldiers in the Human Alliance had almost all stood up, joining the few comrades who had remained standing. In a short time, they formed a huge army of iron strength. In the bright light, people finally saw that it was a majestic paladin who lifted a battle hammer in one hand and held a thick librum in the other hand. Standing in the holy light, he looked like a grand god. My name is Uther Lightbringer. Godly miracle, this is a godly miracle. Awe and reverence rose in the hearts of all the soldiers of the Human Alliance when they saw the great miracle. My goodness. Seeing the old knight with the grey-brown hair and the symbol of silver hand, the Alliance players all exclaimed, this legendary figure only appeared in World of Warcraft as an optional character and didn't show his true form in World of Warcraft, but his legendary stories circulated in every corner of the Alliance. Like Tyrion Fordring, he was also one of the first 5 paladins and leader of the Knights of the Silver Hand. He was also Arthur's mentor. With the title of Lightbringer, he was the person closest to the God of Light in the legendary stories circulating in the Alliance. Just a human. You're bluffing. In the sky above the Shadow Legion, the ultimate existence waved its huge sword and said, everyone, charge. Not only the soldiers of the Shadow Legion on the ground, but also the countless monsters soaring in the sky swarmed over while roaring, as if they intended to swallow the humans, dwarves, and elves who were surrounded by them. Arthur patted the griffin that he was riding on, and it flapped its wings and soared up into the high sky. Although characters in World of Warcraft usually rode war horses, people also traveled around riding griffins and flying mounts in the game. Therefore, it was normal for characters to ride griffins. We're blessed by holy light, all darkness will evaporate. Although they were still puzzled about the situation, countless Alliance players were thrilled to see the legendary hero. While lifting their weapons high in the air, they yelled, "For the Alliance! For the Alliance!" More and more people joined the roar, which became louder and louder. Even the soldiers of the Lianshan Principality and Kingdom were influenced by the contagious atmosphere and yelled with them. These local people realized that this great miracle would save them and their principality. The soldiers and generals of the Morning Light Empire and other kingdoms also joined the chant. The loud shouts of tens of thousands of people resonated across their whole battleground and shook the sky and the ground. Facing the Shadow Legion, which had almost butchered all of them, these soldiers seemed to have gotten rid of their previous fear when they charged forward. The two armies collided with each other, and it seemed like two huge ocean waves began to fight fiercely. Blood sprayed into the sky and on the ground while countless soldiers fell in the fierce battle. Druids, tranquility. Seeing this scene, Elder Sewell yelled and led a large group of elf druids into the battleground. The dark sky was suddenly opened by many whitish-silver light beams. Whitish-silver lights of moon and life spread swiftly from the elves to the battleground around them. Like nectar, the lights sprinkled onto the ground. The soldiers on the front line who had fallen due to severe injuries stood up again with full strength. The troops from the principalities, kingdoms, and empires had never seen such a sight before. They exclaimed and leapt up in elation, "I'm alive again, I'm alive again." Then, they charged forward one after another. Soon, even the main force of the Shadow Legion was torn into several parts under the tireless charges of the Alliance soldiers. The previously overbearing Great Shadow Legion seemed to be on the verge of collapse. At this moment, the beautiful Elf Queen was sitting on the throne of the Elf clan and stared at the battleground with glints of joy and surprise. When did our Elf clan become so powerful? They weren't even this strong last year. A few elders took these elves for a trip. How come they returned with such great power? In the nation's summit, Street Dylan looked at the Elf Queen coldly and said, "Your Majesty, your elf army didn't show such trump cards until the troops of our radiant light godly nation retreated. What's your scheme?" Coldness appeared on the face that was as pure as the moonlight in the Sliver Moon Forest, and her voice was cold and seemed to contain the loneliness of 1,000 years of solitude while she said mildly, "Street Dylan, I knew nothing about it. Besides, when the war began, you didn't count our elf clan in your plan. Now that you retreated without consulting us, you have the face to blame us?" Street Dylan's face instantly turned livid. He said with a snort, "The Shadow Legion is not easy to deal with. I hope you guys use your reasoning and summon back your people. With the elf clan's power and spells, our alliance will surely defeat the Shadow Legion together." Street Dylan. The dignified Dwarf King pointed at the scene on the spiritual spell visual projection and said, "Although I don't know who this other Lightbringer is, do you really think that they will lose?" At this moment, everyone here saw countless phantoms of the Holy Light Battle Hammer transforming into a destructive storm around Uther in the sky through the spiritual spell visual projection. Struck by this storm, countless soldiers of the Shadow Legion fell from the sky like dumplings that were being tossed into a pot of boiling water. Divine storm, divine storm. Countless Alliance players yelled in pleasant surprise. This was a high-level ability from the Burning Crusade, an expansion to World of Warcraft, and Paladins could only learn it once they reached level 70. Chapter 747, A Hard Battle. Release Bloodlust. As the tall and thin figure chanted the incantation, A layer of dark red clouds gradually engulfed the battleground. This spell seemed to contain an unknown demonic energy which brought blood-red glints into the eyes of the soldiers of the Shadow Legion. Their eyes were full of bloodthirst and madness, looking more fearless than the stimulated Alliance army of the Nora continent. Their attacks seemed to contain a cursed power which shot toward the Knights of the Golden Griffin Knight Legion who were charging at the front. With an exclamation, Helen was cut by a saber and instantly felt an invisible force drawing out strength from her body. Then, she stumbled and almost fell. She looked at her opponent and found that the latter had become more energetic than before. The Shadow Legion, which had been at the disadvantage for a while, now fought back and began to obtain the upper hand. "Look," Street Dylan said loudly, "the Shadow Legion isn't so easy to deal with. To be blunt, I think the arrogance and heroism of some individuals and clans can only lead to defeat and destruction." Everyone looked grim. Their army wasn't weak, but their enemy was even stronger with seemingly endless abilities. They didn't even know what percentage of power their enemy had unleashed. The unknown was the most frightening thing. Watching the Shadow Legion's counterattack, even the Elf Queen and the Dwarf King felt uneasy. After all, wars weren't games. Allowing their troops to stay on the battleground would risk their lives. Seeing the hesitation on these people's faces, Street Dylan smiled and thought, "Victory only belongs to us. How can this randomly mixed army obtain the victory?" But at this moment, they heard exclamations again from the spiritual spell visual projection. In the sky, the ferocious and unrivaled old paladin had cleared all the soldiers of the Shadow Legion around him. No enemy dared to linger near him, otherwise, they would be swallowed by the storm of holy and pure lights. At this moment, this old paladin seemed to notice the situation happening on the ground. He lifted the librum, and holy light beams shined down at his summon. This time, the light beams fell on the Shadow Legion. When the soldiers of the Shadow Legion was shined on by the light, the bloodthirsty light in their eyes dimmed and disappeared, and they returned to their original state in a very short time, as if their ferocious bloodthirsty state had never existed. "What's this?" Not only the people at the Nations Summit, but the commanders of the Shadow Legion watched the scene in astonishment as well. They had never heard that the bloodthirsty state could be reversed. The figure sitting on the Shadow Demon Dragon looked at the spellcaster beside him. "I didn't withdraw the spell." The tall and thin mage had chilly glints in its gloomy eyes. "Damn it, they even have a way to disrupt our spells by force. Mass Dispel. I read the introduction on the official website. This is Mass Dispel." All the people cheered. It was another ability that only priest players over level 70 could use. Before Arthur became a paladin, he was a priest. Eager to play this newer version, the Burning Crusade, which had many powerful abilities, a large group of people surrounded Mr. Fang and said, "Sir, can we all learn such abilities?" "Of course, you can," Mr. Fang said with conviction. "This ability can be learned." Their warriors and mages of the Alliance army overheard it and asked, "Can we learn it too?" In the hall where Street Dylan sat clank. A loud noise sounded. Street Dylan slammed his fist on the table before him, making the teacup on the table jump up. With a dark expression, he calmed himself down and projected his figure into the Nations Summit again. "Sorry, I was away for a little while." He stared at the situation on the battleground intently, not believing that the Shadow Legion would be defeated due to this small setback. Sure enough, they made the next move. Master of Energy Myth was a creature with a human body and hooves, and it had horrifying elemental energy around its body. It was said that it was a member of an ancient race that had gone extinct long ago on the Nora continent. These creatures excelled in the use of elements in nature. Despite their excellent innate talents, no one had heard of their existence in this world. However, this creature now appeared in the world as the deputy commander of the Shadow Legion. No one knew what this legion's purpose was, but everyone knew that they only brought shadows, destruction, and death. Master of Energy Neth turned its gaze to the sky and chanted some words that were light as wind. It seemed like this creature was summoning something. a deep and strange long murmur suddenly sounded from the dark clouds covering the sky. Huge shadows extended their way down from the clouds, looking like huge beasts hiding in the deep ocean in ancient times. Their flat and wide bodies flapped like huge wings while the blazing flames they spat crashed down like destructive meteorites. Coming from the extremely high sky, the fireballs didn't look so big from the distant ground, but gradually, the fireballs got closer, and the booming noises that they created were as loud as thunder. Looking up, the blazing fire was destructive enough to smash half of the Alliance soldiers into meat pies or burn them into ashes. The giant fireballs fell toward the iron-like defense line formed by many orc warriors who were the hardest shield standing before the mages and priests. Careful. Sword Saint Wilson and other Saint-level masters were veteran fighters and knew the value of the orcs who formed the front line more than others. After dumping his current opponent at the risk of severe injuries, Wilson stabbed his slim sword at the huge meteorite like a lightning flash. Boom! One meteorite exploded, then the second, the third. Having experienced the desperate moments, these human masters obviously knew the meaning of this war more than anyone else. Boom, boom. With the explosions in the sky, countless debris fell from the sky like a shower. Some of the debris was still several meters wide. The boulders that crashing onto the ground exploded and shot out a shower of flames. The orc warriors only had time to raise their big shields when a huge airwave knocked them into the air. Instantly, howls and screams filled the battleground. When the warriors on the front line who defended the mages and priests with their bodies struggled up again, they looked up and saw another horrifying shower of flames falling from the sky like shooting stars. Chapter 748, For the Horde. At this moment, a trace of helplessness and despair appeared in these warriors' eyes. Even the saint-level masters looked powerless when their opponents charged at them one by one. This was a sense of powerlessness that they had never felt before, even though their army had grown even more powerful than they could have imagined. The horrifying Shadow Legion had again and again shattered their dream of victory with overwhelming force. The orcs had fallen and then got up again and again, but they still couldn't defeat their enemies. The horrifying power of this legion that they faced went beyond their imagination. In the nation's summit, most of the audience found their hearts rise and fall with the changes of the situation on the battleground. The process of this war was so thrilling that even the Elf Queen felt uneasy despite the miraculous resurrection spells possessed by the Alliance army. Under such destructive strikes, the Elf Queen even wondered if the Alliance army on the battleground would be destroyed altogether in the next moment, and the old paladin might not be able to save so many people after he used all his energy, which would lead to the collapse of the whole war. The Elf Queen even considered if she should enter the war herself. But it would mean that the whole clan had come to the final moment. Fang Chi obviously noticed this situation as well. It's time. Suddenly, pitch black lights tore open the sky with sharp whistling sounds. Boom, boom. Radiant fire lights burst out in the sky. It seemed like almost all the meteorite-like fireballs exploded in the high sky. Street Dylan, who had felt relieved, now stared at the spiritual spell visual projection before him intently. Who is it? These people walked up to the spiritual spell visual projection, not wanting to miss any details. Subconsciously, the orc warriors under the meteorites and some human warriors and knights looked up and saw the debris in the sky falling down rapidly like light beams, burning into ashes before they could reach the ground. A black figure leapt up into the sky like a sharp arrow. She drew her bow to the fullest, and then the arrow transformed into a black rainbow, shooting across the sky. Even standing on the ground, the people could feel the suffocating and powerful force in the high sky as the rainbow-like black arrow exploded on the huge beast in the sky with vicious force. Shrill howls instantly resonated in the high sky. Meanwhile, a sharp and ear-piercing whistle seemed to drop an acoustic nuke on the battleground, sweeping across the entire area with its power. The orcs looked up and saw a figure covered by a dark red cloak. She had a bony but beautiful face, dark grey skin, and long, pointy, and slim ears. Endless dark energy that was more horrifying than the shadows swept out with this sharp wail. Wail of the Banshee, Sylvanas, Queen Sylvanas. A horde orc player shouted. In the other world, these players had fought many days and nights for her but had never imagined that the figure who they had been fighting for would come and lead them in a battle in the real world one day. Seeing the legendary heroine of the horde fighting alongside them shoulder to shoulder, warmth surged up in the players' hearts while they were astonished. An orc picked up a battle flag from the ground and lifted it high. With the bright flag flapping on the fierce battleground, he shouted, "For the horde! For the horde!" The orcs in the horde struggled up from the ground and charged at the Shadow Legion with their big shields and huge axes again. Healing totem, follow up, orc brothers. Charge with me. Mr. Dirk shouted, "For Queen Sylvanas! For Queen Sylvanas!" Salah and other elves of the horde hurried after them, wishing that the people before them could move faster so that they could see Queen Sylvanas more clearly. Instantly, others followed the charge. Meanwhile, the soldiers and monsters of the Shadow Legion were still stunned by the wail of the Banshee, and they were hacked down by the wild orcs and other melee warriors. A bigger wound was torn through the Shadow Legion. At this moment, Sylvanas flew to the high sky. Her dark arrows containing cursed power afflicted unimaginable damage in the huge beasts. With shrill howling, they all fell to the ground. Is this an elf? All the audience looked toward the elf queen beside them. Exclamation mark. At this moment, the elf queen stared at the spiritual spell visual projection with widened eyes. I don't know either. How come this elf doesn't look like us? Our elves don't have such dark skin. Or such long ears. What's happening? She was stupefied by the scene. This elf doesn't look like one of us. Of course, the elf queen couldn't reveal these thoughts to others. She looked as cold as before when she said, "Lately, I've concentrated my mind to the teachings of the elf god and had no time to mind the clan business." The first elder took some elders and elves on a trip and seemed to have brought back many unthinkable things. You may ask the first elder after the war ends. Then, she wondered, there are elves other than us in this world? Impossible. Obviously, others had the same thought. Even Queen Isabella, who had been silently sitting on her seat, cast a quick glance at the elf queen and then looked at the new elf in the spiritual spell visual projection. After that, she glanced at the elf queen again and then back to the spiritual spell visual projection. How come this elf's skin color doesn't look right? With this thought, she continued to watch the war. At this moment, arrows shot down like cannonballs from the sky. Struck by the horrifying energy arrows, countless soldiers and monsters of the Shadow Legion both in the sky and on the ground were sent flying together with everything around them. When Sylvanas turned into a banshee, her arrows with silver moon magic power had changed into arrows of death. According to the legends, the people who were killed by this kind of arrowhead would become her death slave. Even a scratch from the arrowhead would rot the wound continuously, and no medicine could heal such a wound. Then, everyone saw the soldiers of the Shadow Legion who had been touched by the dark energy on the arrows die while their flesh rotted. Meanwhile, their skeletons rose from their corpses. This was an ability in Warcraft. In the system version, the characters could use all spells and abilities that they have learned in the prequels, so their abilities were from both Warcraft and World of Warcraft and had been readjusted and balanced. The soldiers of the Shadow Legion stood up from death again and then hacked at their former comrades without any emotions. At this moment, even the Shadow Legion, which knew nothing but killing, seemed to feel an emotion named fear in their hearts. Finally, the entire Shadow Legion began to collapse. Chapter 749, Risking the Honor of a Main Tank. Although the dark minions created by Black Arrows had a maximum limit, they acted as the meat shield in the front line, effectively blocking the charges from the Shadow Legion. Meanwhile, the dark minions were not weak and gradually encroached on the Shadow Legion. For the players who had alt accounts in the Alliance and the Horde, they were familiar with these skeletons. Perhaps they played as skeletons themselves in the game. After all, The orcs and assassins had nothing against these skeletons and usually played with this type of teamed mates, so they fought together with this big army of skeletons. Mage Lily, who had played the Legend of Mewtwo, lifted her hand and summoned a small fragile skeleton from the ground. Huh? He. She released this skeleton into the big army of skeletons. What's this? Where the heck did this elf come from? The people who were watching the war were all ultimate figures from different clans and had naturally seen all kinds of ghosts, demons, and weird creatures. However, none of them had seen anyone who could instantly transform the enemies into their minions. How come this dark-skinned elf is so powerful? Street Dylan stared at the elf queen intently and asked, "Your Majesty Kellybull, don't you think you should explain it to us?" Elf Queen Kellybull's gaze was as cold as moonlight. "Mr. Dylan, if I have to explain every time when a creature resembling an elf appears." She pointed at Uther in the spiritual spell projection and said, "Perhaps you must explain where this Uther who uses light spells comes from." Street Dylan was speechless. Enough. At this moment, Queen Isabella said, "This Uther and the holy light that he uses has nothing to do with us." The problem was, she looked at the sun in the sky and wondered, doesn't the light that the god of radiant light uses come from the suns as the legend claim? Then, where does this holy light come from? She looked up at the two suns in the sky, but the two suns emitted the same kind of sunlight. Is there another kind of light? Meanwhile, others remained frowning, including people like World Mage Hematon, who didn't belong to any force, whether it was other human nations, or the Dwarf clan and Elf clan. At this moment, they saw the Shadow Legion's most powerful figures, including the ultimate Death Lord Draz. Aside from the Death Lord, the other leaders in the Legion hadn't shown much of their powers as well. Master of Energy Myth had just shown a small part of its power and brought great troubles to the Alliance army. They wondered what trump cards the Shadow Legion hadn't shown yet. Under their grim gazes, the Alliance and Horde players had gathered together, and with the Human Alliance army, they tore open the Shadow Legion's formation fearlessly and valiantly. But still, the commanders of the Shadow Legion sat calmly in the sky. They looked surprised but not ruffled. Then, the mage beside Rose chanted in a low voice, and the horrifying seeds of nightmare were activated again. An invisible fear began to spread again on the battleground. At the nation's summit, some people including elves and dwarves looked grimmer. Regardless if Street Dylan's order of retreat was right or wrong, they knew that not everyone could force them to retreat. From this perspective, it proved the great power of the Shadow Legion. After all, they didn't possess godly spells and godly miracles. The elf god hadn't realized any godly miracles for a long time, and the elves hadn't sensed that existence for a long while. The situation was the same with the dwarf clan. Without any possibility to use true godly spells, the alliance of elves, dwarves, and orcs would be at their wits' end in such a situation. "I already tried to dissuade you." Street Dylan obviously had also noticed that this spell was the trigger for the Alliance army's previous turn for worse. The godly spells of this big scale require godly power from the god of radiant light to activate. I can't activate the spell a second time today. At this moment, the viewers were very uneasy. In fact, they had never been so uneasy before. They had the urge to go to the battleground themselves, even though they knew that their participation wouldn't change anything. However, at this moment they saw the orcs, elves, and human alliance army passing straight through the zone filled with that horrifying power. As if they had lost their sense of fear, they continued to hack and slash down soldiers of the Shadow Legion, except for some disturbances among soldiers of the Alliance army who were at the back. The players of Origin's Internet Club who charged in the front didn't show any reaction to the spell. How can it be? Street Dylan stared at the scene with widened eyes. Ineffective? The spell that the Shadow Legion especially concocted for them was ineffective? At this moment, Master of Energy Myth cast a more horrifying war magic spell. In the dark sky, countless thunderbolts zigzagged and then turned into a huge sun-like lightning ball under the thunderclouds. Boom, boom. Countless lightning beams in twisted snake-like forms swept across the ground. In the horrifying lightning storm, even thick-skinned and shielded warriors were knocked flying by these horrifying lightning snakes. The smell of burnt flesh filled the battleground. At this moment, Uther had rushed to Master of Energy Nith, while raising his battle hammer high. He yelled, "Peace is our loftiest ideal, but to realize it, everyone must fight for it." A melodious holy song seemed to come from the sky, and angelic holy light floated down and spread out giant wings of light. The holy light fell like a shower of radiant golden lights. Countless warriors who had been severely wounded in the battle were recovering at a horrifyingly fast speed instead of a visible speed. Lightning bolts had burned their bodies into charcoal, but in the next moment, they recovered their full health. The destruction speed of the lightning bolts was not as fast as their recovery speed. Divine hymn, "Glory belongs to the Alliance." Riding on griffins, a group of knights and warriors raised their huge swords and followed Uther closely, killing their way to the middle of the sky. Master of Energy Nith blocked them like a natural barrier. The fierce battle on the ground was still going on, but this most elite group consisted of the dwarves and human warriors who rode all kinds of flying mounts charged at the front line with their shields. "Raf!" Dwarf Elder Sork shouted. The dwarf who had been wiped out many times in Mr. Fang's raiding party charged at the horrifying master whose power far surpassed that of humans. He risked the honor of a main tank. Chapter 750, Saint-Slaying Battle. Level 9, Level 8? Master of Energy Nith looked at the two warriors who charged at it with shields in their hands disdainfully. Their strengths were high in the eyes of the average people, but Nith was an existence who looked down on average saint-level masters, let alone level 8 and level 9 warriors. The conference hall of the Nations Summit got noisy since the audience couldn't believe that these two level 8 and level 9 warriors dared to charge at such an existence. In the next moment, Dwarf Ruff and the other dwarf warrior held up their huge shields and slashed their double-bladed axes at Nith's middle section with vicious forces. However, before the blades touched Nith's body, a horrifying energy current swept out like a storm. The huge and violent presence sent the surrounding warriors flying when they were barely able to scramble and block it. Faint magic shield lights lit up on the huge shields, and the tremendous energy was weakened greatly when it passed the huge shields. The ranged teammates behind them were not affected at all. Meanwhile, several pure holy light beams fell on the dying defense warriors who then recovered quickly and charged again. Then, another light shield fell on their heads and spread all over their bodies. The priest's spell, Holy World, Shield, gave them more powerful protection. Meanwhile, crisp gunfire came. Elder Sork lifted his magic firearm and fired. The bullet that was engulfed in magic lights instantly exploded on Nith. A faint light barrier protected it from all the damages that might have been inflicted by the explosion. When it was about to fight back with a sneer, ice pellets, blazing flames, lightning flashes, arrows, and all kinds of magic lights crashed toward it in waves. Now, it wanted to retreat but saw the warriors with huge shields standing on its routes of exit. Master of Energy Nith could feel that regardless of which direction he took, he would receive the most efficient blockage and stormy attacks. In the previous raids and instances, the players had to deal with enemies with great strength and high levels of intelligence, such as the Lich Lord Kel'Thuzad and the Old God Cthulhu. Although the dwarves had just reached the second stage of the raid against Cthulhu and hadn't cleared all stages yet, they still had to be perfect in every detail from equipment, abilities, and even positions. Otherwise, the players would be wiped out for a whole year in the first stage when they encountered the death ray which would kill them with one touch. They had been reckless warriors who could only tank damage with shields when they first did the raid in Scarlet Monastery led by Mr. Fang, but now, they had become the top-level master players who were perfect with every detail. At this moment, even Master of Energy Nith was struck by the illusion that it was facing not a few warriors but a wall or a cell with 4 iron walls. "You are seeking die." Master of Energy Neith gathered tremendous energy again and aimed it at the mages and priests in the back of the group. This energy was too huge for mortals to block and might turn anyone it touched into ash. Yes, as the most powerful spellcaster among the saint-level masters, Master of Energy Neith could turn an area 1,000 km away into a scorched land without moving its feet. Its spell abilities were obviously greater than those of demon spirit Sal. When it cast the spell, the violent energy between the sky and the land not only gathered above the heads of mages and priests, but it transformed into a destructive hurricane of energy all around it. No spells, including counterspells, could break this protective shield formed by the horrifyingly huge energy and hurt Neith. Unleash the full force. At this moment, the commander was the first elder of the elf clan. As a saint-level master, his strength wasn't as strong as his opponent, but his judgment was much more acute than the average saint-level masters. Of course, the level 8 and level 9 existences had a greater execution ability than average people. Countless lights of black, white, red, and blue crashed down like a meteor shower, with about 100 mages above level 8 casting spells. The horrifying magic lights could almost wipe out anything before them. Besides, First Elder Hyrule, a saint-level master, joined the attack as well. Neith's casting speed was very fast, but the elf clan's first elder and all the mages' spells were instantly cast, and they were even faster. The condensed protective shield was broken in a short time, and then, shield bash, counterspell, Shadow's Fury, Hammer of Justice. Neith's face paled a little, and the horrifying force in the sky began to scatter after losing the energy source. The spellcasting failed. Then, countless spells poured toward it wildly. After releasing the last divine hymn, others scattered like dissipating golden lights. Obviously, the character whom Mr. Fang materialized with the help of the carrier rock had reached the time limit. If Uther were still here, Neith would be very cautious, but now, the mages in the back can heal injuries and cast all kinds of spells without worrying about being attacked. If I can wipe out the mages who can heal injuries and attack from the distance, I'll see how you can fight me. Neith tore open a pitch-black crack in space and vanished in it. When it appeared in the next instant, it stood among the priests and druids in the back of the group. Seeing this scene, even the people at the distant nation's summit exclaimed, like a tiger in a herd of sheep. It created lightning bolts and flames from its hands and reached for a young mage with its claws. Seeing this frightening scene, almost everyone's hearts were in their throats. The audience had seen how it tore open space with its claws, so they knew what damages its claws could inflict if the strike hit. Swoosh! A white light flashed. Blink! As if he had practiced it countless times, Mage Merlin appeared dozens of meters away in the blink of an eye. Meanwhile, he pointed his staff lightly and shot a huge fireball at Neith as if it was a cannonball. Even though Neith didn't understand how Merlin had dodged its attack, its claw reached for Priest Dickers who stood nearby without a pause. Its real target was Dickers, but two light beams fell on Dickers almost simultaneously. Hand of Protection. Holy Word, Shield, Crack. Immediately, a shocking pitch-black crack appeared in the place that its hand touched, but in the next instant, it was horrified to find that its claws didn't break the thin shield. The Hand of Protection was immune to all physical damage and thus couldn't be broken by any physical attacks from Saint-level masters. This attack could scare any average Saint-level masters, but these people calmly handled it as if it was nothing unusual. At this moment, the audience at the nation's summit and the Death Lords sitting in the high sky began to realize that these level 8 and level 9 figures, who were like cannon fodder in the eyes of the Saint-level masters, were not here under reckless impulse. Instead, they came here to butcher the Saint-level master.